I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your home for deer hunting news, stories, and strategies. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and this is episode number 192. And today in the show, we are joined by the CEO of Backcountry Hunters Anglers, Land Tawney. And we're discussing the recent controversy around national monuments from a hunter-angler perspective and other public land issues and news. All right, folks, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by Sitka Gear. And today we are going to be joined by Land Tawney. And Land is the CEO of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, the leading conservation organization fighting on behalf of sportsmen and women for our public lands, wildlife, and waters. And we had Land on the show, it might have been like 2 years ago now, but I wanted to have him on again to discuss a topic that has been all over the news over the past week or so, and that is this national monument controversy. As you might have heard or seen last week, President Trump announced that his administration will be making drastic cuts to protections on a couple of different pieces of our public lands. Notably, he proposed a reduction in size of Bears Ears National Monument by 85% and cutting Grandstaircase-Escalante National Monument in half. So there's been a lot of talk about what this means, what kind of precedent this sets, and concerns for, all sorts of different concerns for those of us who value public lands and wild places. So you might have seen something related to this on your Facebook feed or on the nightly news, but there's also a decent bit of confusion and maybe even some misinformation coming from both sides of the issue too. So with all that hubbub out there, I think it's probably pretty easy for a hunter or angler to be a little confused about what all this means, what we should be thinking and doing about all this. So with that all being the case, Land is going to hop on here soon with us to help us understand, what national monuments are, what this recent announcement means for the future of public lands, how this is going to impact hunters and anglers, sportsmen and women. And then finally, we're also talking a little bit more about other public land changes and challenges and issues that have been kind of rolling out over recent months, and what we need to know as hunters and anglers about all of that. So please stick around for this one because honestly, I really do believe that the future of our ability to hunt and fish and hike and camp and kayak and raft and whatever, explore these wild public places, that future is dependent on us, sportsmen and women, understanding these issues and standing up for these places. Because as Theodore Roosevelt once said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but he said, the wild creatures cannot speak for themselves, so we must and we will. And I think that is very much still true today. So that's the main event for the episode here. But before we get to that, as we do every week, we're going to take maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We'll see how it goes for our weekly pregame show, catching up on the latest in the hunting adventures of myself and the one and only extraordinary I don't have a really great intro for you today, Dan, but you're extraordinary. I'll give you that.
One of a kind, right?
One of a kind. So am I right on all that, Dan? This is important stuff to talk about, but we first need to give our updates, yeah?
Yeah, dude. I tell you what, I am so consumed at the same time confused on what the actual truth is about a lot of these public land scenarios. You know, it's like you have one side saying this is horrible for sportsmen. They're taking away all of our public land. They're going to sell it to the oil gods or whatever. And then you got the other who say, yeah, give it away. We don't want it to be run by the Fed anymore and all this stuff. And like you said, it's difficult, especially in today and where people decide to get their news, what the actual truth is and the details about where this information is coming from. So
yeah, very, very true. And I think, if you're coming into this, if someone listening to this hasn't heard some of our past episodes related to some of these public land issues, like the public land transfer, which is kind of a movement that has been going on for a handful of years now. There's a couple episodes that I'll definitely recommend you go back and listen to, like one we had with Randy Newberg a couple Septembers ago. There's one we had with Whit Fosberg, which would be a good one to listen to. So there's some kind of foundation setting we do in those where we talk about some of these high-level issues related to the future of public lands, why some people want to open them up to development or give them away to states or sell them off, et cetera, et cetera. Right from the get-go, I'll tell you, and Dan, you obviously know that, and anyone who's been listening knows that I am a strong opponent of those types of ideas. And both you and I, Dan, we value our public landscapes so much.
Right.
So I think this issue is near and dear to my heart. And to your question and your point, here in a few minutes when Land gets on with us, and this interview I already recorded, so I know what he says, I know what we talk about, and he does a great job of helping us understand exactly what's happening, what is real, what is noise, what really matters, why these things are things that we as hunters and anglers should be paying attention to. Whether you live on the East Coast, the West Coast, the Midwest, the Rocky Mountains, Florida, wherever, these places matter. They are available to each and every one of us, whether we're going to use them this year or 20 years from now. I think it's important that we stand up because for essentially the entire history of America's public lands, it has been hunters and anglers that have been the main people standing up, fighting for these places, helping getting these places created, funded, taken care of. It's been on us since the beginning, and it still is on us here today. And, I think you and I can both point to some very special moments in our own lives that took place on these types of landscapes and locations. And with you having kids and me having my first on the way, it just becomes even more important and even more just, I don't know. I just want to make sure that these opportunities are available for my little guy. And
yeah, it's crazy. This is the way I look at a situation like this is just maybe I don't get to go out and experience these places because Iowa is 98 point something percent. It's like less than 2% state/public ground, right? Or like say state or federal ground, quote unquote public, right?
Yep.
You go out west, there's a lot more opportunity for that. But what concerns me is like I have hope that I can go out and do that, someday do that. And I want my kids to be able to have the hope to say, if I wanted to, I could go out there and climb this mountain. And without that, it just seems like like a world that is just all, and I know what I'm saying is the worst case scenario. Like you go and you drive out into the mountains and you're standing on these roads and you imagine these picturesque vistas. And then all you see is like oil wells and mines and, the mountains are still there, but they're covered up. The animals aren't there anymore because they've been driven out. And it just seems like a sad world from that point on.
I 100% agree with you. And it's just every year these places are getting chipped away at. And of course, progress is progress, development and businesses and all these things that got to happen, right? That's obviously part of our own existences is having these things, but there's got to be a responsible way to do these things. There's got to be a way to still respect and take care of the handful of places that we have left that are still somewhat pristine and wild and public. I mean, it's such a small proportion of what's going on. Why can't we just hold on to these last few places? Because you're right, they do offer that opportunity, that dream, that hope for anyone that there's still somewhere you can get away to. And man, you spend a day or two out in some of these wild places, and it is medicine for the soul, I think.
Right. Absolutely.
And a writer, Wallace Stegner, once talked of these public lands, these places out. He was specifically talking about some of these places that are wilderness areas being the geography of hope. And I think that's a pretty powerful way to describe these places. So, yeah, I don't know, absolutely, man. I had a very fortunate year to be able to explore a lot of these places myself over the spring and summer and fall, and it just continues to drive home all these things. We got to stand up for them. So
I know you're working on a quote unquote public land project.
Yeah.
Can you give us any insight on what that's going to be? Can you give us a sneak peek, or am I blowing the cover for you?
I can't give you too much more information, but I can say that the project will be announced in the relatively near-term future.
Okay.
So finally, this thing that I've been kind of referring to loosely and every once in a while over the last year or so, it's happening. It's very exciting. I'm pumped about it. I've spent a lot of time on it over the last year. Going to be spending a whole lot more time on it this coming year. But it's kind of, knock on wood, it's going to be the realization of a dream I've had for a long time. So excited about that. It is related to public lands. It's related to a lot of things we're talking about here. And I hope people are going to enjoy it.
Yeah.
So that's all I can share right now.
I tell you what, this is what I'm about to tell you is real, and I really do this. I sit in my cubicle and I daydream while I'm doing my work about getting out and heading west, and I, at night after the kids go to bed, I'll sit with an iPad on my lap, and I'll just look at Google Maps, and as pictures pop up,
yeah,
I'll click on the pictures, and I'll go, and I even have a document somewhere. It's in my messy desk somewhere, but anyway, it's just like, okay, well, that looks cool. I want to go visit that, and it's just a list.
Yeah,
and maybe someday I'll get to do that. Maybe I won't, but it's a dream. And it's just something that has been in my blood since my dad took me on an Amtrak train from Iowa to Denver, Colorado. And then we rented a car and we went up into Rocky Mountain National Park. And then we went some other places around the area. And then I went back to Colorado maybe one or two more times between now and then. But every time I go out there, it makes the West, to me, makes you feel so small that, I don't know, it makes, like, where I'm at in my job, and I know some of the guys out in the East Coast, and hell, I live in Iowa, and that's not even highly populated, but I live in a highly dense, a dense area of Iowa. And I think, like, when you walk out there and you become, like, just like through osmosis, where you become less, like, you feel smaller. And I really don't know how to put it into words, but I feel smaller, and I like that feeling. Yeah. I like that the surroundings, I don't know, it's like my surroundings are bigger, and it gives me like a cleansing feeling. I don't know what it is, and I know we're getting way off topic here, but
No, I 100% know what you're talking about there, and feel it myself, and agree. It's important, and it's important to point out, even though I'm personally a sucker for the West and
yeah,
really, really love it, there are big, still pretty wild public places in the East and in the South, and those things are to be celebrated too, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So real quick, I don't want to go too long here because I want to make sure that we don't scare people away before we get land on.
Right.
But do you have any public land adventures that you're planning for this coming year? Do you have anything on the dream list? Or
yeah, man, definitely. And a lot of it just depends on time and money, just like everything in life. I want to get out to do an elk hunt in Colorado.
Yep.
And then I want to throw in a secondary hunt out of state, maybe for whitetail. I don't know if that would necessarily be a public land hunt or not. I know the elk hunt will be a public land hunt. That's going to take priority, and that might even take priority over whitetails in Iowa this year. Like if I have to sacrifice time during the rut for whitetails to go elk hunting, I think I'll probably do it this year.
Yeah.
Just because since we went on that trip like 3 years ago now, I can't explain it again. I just think about it every day. And even though it sucked at times, it was still better than sitting in a cubicle. You know what I mean? Like,
oh yeah,
it's just, I need more adventure. I had a guy talking to me about this the other day. He's a dad, and he's got a marriage, and there's times when he started talking to me, and I don't know anything about women. I'm married and I have a daughter. I don't know anything about them. But like for men, and I think it's something in their DNA that they need that. They need to step away from their family for a little bit. It makes them better when they return. They need to be outside in nature, and they need to rough it. And I think it just what that does is it kind of gets you back to your core being, because in a way you still are an animal. Right. And it lets you, expose that side of yourself. And then when you come back to your family, you're just a better husband, you're a better father. And I tell you what, I feel that after even going on like a week rut hunt here in Iowa.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to get back to that. I mean, if you look at the story of like of humanity, it's been just a very tiny little bit of time that we've actually not been living out in the wild, hunting, gathering, living off the wild, doing these types of very difficult physical things just to survive. I mean, if the history of humanity is a book, it's only like the last paragraph of the last page that is, working in cubicles and sitting in an office or even in a factory or anything like that. So the human body and psyche has evolved, and still to this day has not changed from the body and psyche that was needed to survive on the plains of Africa. So that is what we are meant to do. But instead we're sitting at computers tapping away while like some inner part of us is rotting away.
That's exactly how I feel. Dude, I feel like there is an incredible Hulk inside of me every day that is just waiting to like climb on top of a mountain and just beat my chest and yell. And I can't do that. Like it just, I don't know. Anyway,
hear you, man. I hear you.
I know it's early, but you got any public land adventures?
So yeah, for sure. It's going to be a little bit more moderate of a schedule than I've had the past few years, just because we got the little one due in February, and so we're not 100% sure how that's going to impact what we're able to do. We're still planning on doing a lot of stuff and taking them along with us, but we're kind of going to play it by ear and just kind of see how we're feeling about things, how we can adjust. But I do know I'm going to be doing a backpacking trip at Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore in the UP of Michigan. I'm going to be doing a backpacking and peak bagging trip in Colorado and Nevada sometime in the summer with a buddy of me.
What's a peak?
Yeah, so
a peak packing trip.
Yeah, so peak bagging is basically just like a term for climbing to the top of a mountain that doesn't require like technical climbing skills and ropes.
Are you going to do a 14er?
Yeah, some that kind of stuff.
You son of a gun, because that is literally on my bucket list. Like if I could step away from my job today and even take my family with me or whatever, this is a pipe dream. My goal in life is to climb every 14er in Colorado.
Oof, that's like 43 of them or something.
54.
54. All right, there you go. Yep. I like that though.
Yeah.
You got to get your wife to move to Colorado then maybe.
I know. I got a crazy story we can share another time about my first attempt at a 14er.
Oh, yeah.
Got caught in some weather. It was nasty.
Uh-oh. We'll definitely have to cover that one at some point. But yeah, man, that would be a pretty awesome thing to do. And so I think we're going to try to tackle a couple of them while we're out there. I'm thinking like 3-4 days in Colorado and then drive across to Nevada and do a backpacking trip probably up in the Ruby Mountains, I think.
Nice.
And those will be part of this project that I keep on referring to as well. And then definitely want to try to do some Western hunts. I just don't know exactly how much time, if it'll be a week or if I can get away with 2 weeks. I don't know. And then we're going to go, my wife and I and the boy are going to get out there for at least 2 to 4 weeks maybe during the summer. And
Nice.
maybe this year, though, might not do the camper. Maybe we'll rent a house or something or a little cabin.
Right.
Probably Montana and do some fishing and hiking and stuff, in the national forests and parks and stuff around there. So tentatively something like that. But who knows what it might look like 6-7 months from now when I've got a 5-month-old kid. But we just bought him a nice little new down winter jacket and getting his outerwear all ready. So he's going to be – our baby shower was just this past weekend.
Nice.
And my sister bought me like a really, really nice like Osprey backpack child carrier.
Oh, yeah, I got one of those.
Yep, so we can do our hiking and backpacking trips still, but just tote him along in the back. So I'm just getting really excited about that. I can't wait to share these places and these types of things with my son here, and just really, really excited about that. So, and I think that like I mentioned at the beginning, just hammers home how important our topic is again today.
Absolutely.
It's not just about you and me. It's about our kids, kids. It's about those future generations. So, what do you say we wrap this up and hop over to our interview with Land?
Sounds good.
All right, let's take a quick break for a word from our partners at Sitka Gear, and then we will talk national monuments and public lands with Land Tawney.
For this week's Sitka story, we're joined by Bryce Lamley, a Sitka whitetail ambassador who tells us about an improbable hunt with his longbow at ground level in a Nebraska cornfield.
Well, it was October of 2007, and my first year wearing Sitka gear, and I was having a hard time finding the deer. And the place I usually go then is into the cornfield, and it's an irrigated cornfield, so it's a jungle in there, but there's a lane to the center pivot, and I climbed the center pivot, and about sunset, really nice buck walked out along the pivot lane, and there's some grassy area in there. I figured I didn't have anything to lose, so I went into the corn and tiptoed down the corn rows to the center pivot track that I thought would bring me out within range of the buck. It was pretty crunchy in there, and I decided that I had nothing to lose. I was positive by now the deer had heard me, and so I began pulling on ears of corn and making noise on purpose, including a little bit of grunting, hoping that the deer would think it was just another deer. As I reached the second pivot track, I began going back toward the lane where I thought the deer might be out in the open, and it turned out the deer was right in the pivot track almost with me. And I got within 5 yards, and all of a sudden he was there, and I realized that I was not going to probably get a shot. We had kind of a face-off, and the buck bounded back out into the open, but he wasn't completely spooked. And I was able to tiptoe a few rows closer to the edge, and sure enough, he was standing there, and as it turned out, about 12 yards away, and I was able to get an arrow through between the corn stalks and with my longbow, and I whacked him pretty good, and he ran across the opening into the corn on the other side, where I could visually track his progress until I heard a big thud. And kind of an improbable hunt, and one of my most exciting ones. Well, certainly wasn't one of my biggest deer, but absolutely one of the most exciting encounters I've had.
On Bryce's hunt, which took place in eastern Nebraska, he was wearing Sitka's original mountain pants and vest. If you'd like to create a Sitka story of your own, or to learn more about Sitka's technical hunting apparel, visit sitkagear.com.
All right, with me now is Land Tawney. Welcome to the show, Land.
Mark, thanks for having me back.
I appreciate it. And Had a great time chatting with you. Maybe it was a year and a half or so ago on the podcast, and we took that opportunity to kind of get to know you and Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And since that foundation was already set on the podcast, I will send people that aren't familiar with you back to listen to that one so that we can get right into some kind of current hot topics that are going on right now, and that's related to national monuments. So, Land, I know that you've got a lot of experience and understanding of what all this means, what's happening today in current events in the news. I think a lot of hunters and anglers over the last week or so have seen talk of national monuments and what's going on over in Utah with Bears Ears and Grand Staircase-Escalante. So I was hoping we could talk about that. And
yeah,
at a high level, can you maybe kick things off for us by helping us understand, what is a national monument? And maybe talk about the history of that too, how they came to be, what that has meant in the history of public lands.
For sure. So, I think that like you go back to Theodore Roosevelt, and when Roosevelt was in the presidency, is kind of when our conservation ethic I think became really part of the fabric of America, and as that's carried through today, we're kind of the envy of the world. And one of the tools in the toolbox, that he signed into law in 1906 was the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act gives the president the ability to set aside lands for cultural reasons, as well as scientific. And so, he started, and I'll step back, is that, prior to him signing that bill into law, the Boone and Crockett Club, which came on in 1887, they were looking and try to figure out, different tools in the toolbox for the president to help conserve some of the best of the best. And so, they helped write the law. The president signed it into law in 1906, and then, he starts to designate these monuments. And really what these monuments, it doesn't really stop a lot of existing uses. And so whether that's grazing, hunting, fishing, all that stuff is allowed. What it does preclude is extractive kind of industries, so oil and gas, and let's say coal. And so, this act has been used by 16 presidents. That's 8 Democrats and 8 Republicans. It stood the test of time, to where, these are very special places, and it hasn't been, used that much, but it's been done to, protect places. I think the other thing that this is not just, it's not a law that really has been, it's just like the president one day wakes up and is like, oh, I like that area, and I'm going to go designate this place as a national monument. And there's a lot of conversations with people on the ground. One of the ones that Roosevelt did was Mount Olympus in Washington, which he did strictly to protect elk. And those elk ended up being named Roosevelt elk by the guy who was that did the taxonomy there. But that was after talking to a bunch of local people, and at that point they were under threat of kind of some timber harvest, unfettered timber harvest, and that's why they designated it as a monument. So it's something that again, the review that was undertaken by the president this year. It encompassed 11 million acres, which that was 27 monuments. And when you think about 11 million acres in the actual whole of what we have as our public lands, we have 640 million acres. And so that 11 million acres is a real kind of small chunk of that, and really the best of the best. I'll take the Upper Missouri Breaks National Monument that's here in Montana. It was designated by President Clinton, and it wasn't done, in total no controversy. There was definitely controversy there, but now it's one of the best places to hunt elk, bighorn sheep, and mule deer in the entire world, and it's a coveted place to hunt. And so, this Antiquities Act is something, again, that's stood the test of time until recently. The recent actions that have happened this last year.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look back in history to the actions of Teddy Roosevelt. Even then, when he signed this into law, soon after began creating national monuments of his own, it was not without controversy either, right? There were people back then who weren't happy with him doing these things. But for example, like you mentioned, Mount Olympus. Now I think that eventually was evolved into Olympic National Park. or the Grand Canyon at the time was very controversial when he proclaimed that a national monument. Now, of course, I don't think there's anyone in the world who thinks it's a bad idea that we protected that area. That said, there still were those with different incentives or different motivations, who didn't want that to happen. Now, moving forward, looking down the line now, from a hunter perspective, how have national monuments fit into, hunter access, hunter opportunity? Because a lot of people like to say, oh, national monuments, they put all these new restrictions. You can't hunt, you can't gain access, you can't do all these things. I'm hearing this in the news right now from certain people and parties, and
Sure.
as I understand it, I'm thinking that's largely false. Can you clarify that for me?
Yeah, the 27 national monuments that were under review, like all the ones that you could hunt on prior to designation, you could hunt on after designation. So none of that changed. I think the big thing that changes is that you cannot do oil and gas extraction, coal, uranium, like other kind of large kind of extraction kind of activities. And so the hunting and fishing opportunities that were there before, you still have them today. And so that was not changed at all. Now, I will tell you that there's a national monument. It's called Castle Mountains, and it's in California. It was not one of the monuments that was under review because it didn't fit like the size requirement. But that's a case where a new manager came in, and the manager was like, I don't think that hunting is a necessary use here, and so they stopped hunting on that national monument. Now, is that something that we were disappointed in? Absolutely, and that's something that we're working to rectify, both with Secretary of Interior Zinke and then also a local congressman in California.
Okay.
So that did happen. I think one of the things that we put together a report that people can go look at online, and it's really about kind of like the history of national monuments, and then the way that that some of the greatest hunting opportunities in this country that are on national monuments, and then how we like to see them going forward. And one of the ways to exclude what just happened that happened at Castle Mountains is to really have hunting part of that proclamation from the beginning, so that no matter what, it's designated as a use that wants to be carried forward. So I'm not gonna tell you like that every single national monument everywhere in the United States is like the best thing since sliced bread. But the ones that were under review, you could hunt before this whole review, or before that they were designated. And now, to be quite frank, like you can hunt afterwards. Nothing has really changed there. What has changed again is kind of this opportunities for extraction, and I'll take Staircase-Escalante in particular. Desert bighorn sheep are not doing great. Their populations are on the rise in some parts of the country, but in others, they're dwindling. And the Staircase-Escalante happens to have some of the best habitat for desert bighorn sheep. Well, with this change in management, which is happening with the decision that the president made on Monday, is now that coal reserve, which is smack dab in the middle of some of the best desert bighorn sheep habitat, is now like there's an opportunity to extract that. And those bighorn sheep can't speak for themselves, right? And my guess is they don't want coal in their bedroom. But that's why one of the reasons why we're very disappointed with that designation.
Yeah, so
change designation, I guess.
Let's speak about that a little bit more, because two myths I want to kind of make sure that we clarify, and these are kind of coming from both sides a little bit. You hear those in favor of either changing the size of the monuments or trying to rescind them entirely. That kind of camp there likes to say that national monuments are a land grab by the federal government. Now, I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's pretty inaccurate, as anything that can become a national monument, any national monument, was federal public land already. They're not taking private land, they're not taking state land, they're simply saying, okay, this is federal public land already, we're going to proclaim it a national monument, which gives it some additional protections. Now, on the flip side, after what happened here this week, where the talk of downsizing the monuments, there's some who are upset about that, but they're saying the president's stealing your land. Now, as
Right.
much as I appreciate the sentiment of wanting to keep our public land public, that is you're playing loose with the facts a little bit there, because even in this case, right, we are not eliminating public land, we're not selling public land, it's just reducing protections on public land. Am I right in that assessment?
Mark, you're a student, and you're getting through kind of the rhetoric on both sides, right? I think that it wasn't like you said before, it wasn't a land grab. This was just another level of protection. And again, all the places we could hunt and fish before, those designations on the 27, that were under review, we could hunt and fish after the monuments were designated. And then these are not being sold. And I think that there's some people that want to take advantage of the kind of the growing awareness and kind of the ire, that happened around, let's say Chaffetz, back in March when he tried to sell 3 million acres like that. I guess action was swift and it was unapologetic, and I think people are trying to cash in on that in this instance. This is not about selling public lands; it's more about a sellout to industry and reducing those protections. And so, is that going to happen? Again, I think something to be careful there too is, is that coal that I talked about in Escalante, is that going to be developed tomorrow? It's not going to be developed tomorrow, but it's definitely a threat, and it's a threat to that habitat, and that's why it was set aside in the first place. When I think about all the oil and gas that's, at Bears Ears, if oil stays at $50 a barrel, that's not going to ever be developed. If oil goes back up, there's definitely going to be a threat there. So this is not about a sell-off of public lands at all, and I think that hurts credibility, to be totally honest, Mark.
Yeah.
Because that wolf is crying, or your people are crying wolf, and I just it doesn't make sense to me. Besides the point that they're trying to capitalize on some of the anger that people have already expressed, but I think it's disingenuous.
Yeah, I felt the same way, and I felt like you're losing credibility when you start skewing things in that way. There's already enough here to say, hey, this is an issue, let's talk about it. I think there's already enough factually that you can point to this being something that's concerning. You don't need to exaggerate it even more and then just lose your ability to be on the right side of the facts. So that was disappointing to see. But I guess, to your earlier point, it is also disappointing that these protections are being taken away, and that the opportunity for these places that are very, very special places, not just from a hunting and fishing perspective, not just from a recreation, climbing, hiking, backpacking perspective, but also, from a cultural perspective to the native tribes there. And I know that's a little bit outside of our wheelhouse of what we usually talk about when it comes to the hunting and angling community, but still something pretty important that certainly should be respected. Can you kind of give us a high level overview though, because we kind of jumped right into it. We didn't really talk in detail about what actually happened. Why was this review started? What were the final decisions? What was announced this week? What does it mean?
Right. So the president asked Secretary Zinke early last year, to review, what had these national monuments that have been designated over the last, I think they went back 25 years, and just to see, how they were designated and to see if it made sense. And so, the secretary went through this review process. He went out and visited, I think, half a dozen or about a dozen or so monuments, and then, gave kind of, I guess at the same time, there was a public comment period. And this public comment period generated over 1 million comments. Those comments have been analyzed, and about 98% of them were for keeping, these monuments the way they are. Was that an organized effort? Absolutely, because people saw the threat of those protections being taken away. But it's overwhelmingly when it's 98% to 2. And so then there was a leaked memo that came out this summer. It was from the secretary up to the president that gave some indication on which ones that they were looking at. Staircase-Escalante and Bears Ears were kind of at the top of those lists. And so then you get to, there's a bunch of time has passed since then. You didn't really know if it was the actual final report because it was a leaked document, and there was some discrepancies in there that weren't factual. But then you get to what happened this Monday, and that's really the president went down to Utah, and the reductions of and proposed major. I mean, these aren't little teeny redrawing of kind of lines. These are major reductions, and so that's where we are now. Now, there's lawsuits that are being filed, and I think we've looked into the legal side of this a lot. We're not going to file a lawsuit ourselves, but I think we think the president's action was illegal. Again, these aren't little boundary kind of adjustments. These are major rollbacks, and so now we're going to be caught up in court, which is unfortunate, but it also provides a backstop. At the same time, you've got legislation that's proposed by Congressman Bishop out of Utah to totally change the way the Antiquities Act works, and only do it for cultural reasons and take the scientific piece out of that. And so when you think about places like the Upper Missouri Breaks here in Montana, it's got some cultural resources, but the majority of that is because it's just a special place that really isn't duplicated anywhere else. And so for scientific reasons, keeping it that way and and protecting the wildlife resources that are there. So I think there's some unknowns now on what's going to happen, Mark. I think that it is kind of a sad day. It's the largest protection rollback that's ever happened in this country, whether that's monuments or anything else. And so that's just a bad precedent to be setting. I think the worry that we have is that I talked earlier is that so far this law and the monument designations have really stood the test of time. And now that this has happened, what happens to the rest of the monuments that are out there, and how safe are they? They become a political football that gets passed and forth between administration to administration, which causes a lot of ambiguity and causes I think a lot of unknowns that, is that what's going to happen? And, that quite possibly could happen. And that's why through this whole thing, we use the mantra, attack on one is attack on them all, because you're really going after the sanctity that has been the Antiquities Act, till date.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot, there's not, my crystal ball, it's kind of hard to say what's going to happen. I think this is something that will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. And how long that takes, who knows? And then we'll see, what's happening at the legislative level. I will tell you that I don't think this is something that the president came up with. I definitely don't think it's something that Secretary Zinke came up with. I think this is pressure that's coming out of Utah, where, we a lot of this kind of anti-public land rhetoric comes out of. And whether that's, the sale of public lands or the change in management, it's really being driven out of Utah. And it's unfortunate, but it's also a place that there really isn't, a lot of sportsman engagement in Utah. And I think about, that's we're growing a chapter there, but it's I think part of the reason that these policies are coming out of there and this angst is coming out of there is just because there isn't really a good organized sportsman space in Utah.
Is there some political back scratching happening here that could be why some of these things are happening that the Utah delegation wants, but that seem to be opposed to some of the other things that Secretary Zinke has said are important to him in this administration, like public land? We were hearing these things, early on in the administration, that they're going to be for sportsmen and for public lands, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
Teddy Roosevelt Republican. But some of these actions more recently seem maybe not in line with that. Is this something that's getting right into the dirty stuff of politics? Maybe that's causing all this.
I think that's part of it. I think back to Roosevelt's day. You talked about how he wasn't necessarily applauded by every single American for doing these designations, right? There was people that were opposed to him, and the people that were opposed to him were really big industry. And I think if you don't have to look too much farther to simplify kind of what's going on here, is that this is big industry. They've developed a lot of this country, and they want to develop more. And the lease sales that happen for oil and gas, like on the outside of Bears Ears, just this last year, that's right on the doorstep, and they want to get more. And so, I think things that for us to think about as Americans is that oil and gas development is important, but it's when that's done in the right way. And again, right now this market is flooded with cheap oil and gas, and so does it make sense for us to to be developing these places? What makes America unique is some of our protected places where we can hunt and fish. We're protecting cultural resources. You name it, clean air, clean water, and I think so go these public lands, kind of so goes America. And so I think we really need to look ourselves in the mirror and do we want these special places to continue? I think we haven't talked about other things yet, but you look at like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge up in Alaska, or Bristol Bay up in Alaska, or the Boundary Waters up in Minnesota. These are all very, very special places that not only again provide great opportunities to hunt and fish, but are also they provide clean air and clean water. And to me, like that's the precedence that's being set here, is that it's kind of development at all costs. And I just don't think that there's any point in our American history that development at all costs has really, been in the best interest of the American people.
Yeah.
So something for us all to stay vigilant on.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on. And of course, to your point, that there's a place for development. Of course, these different things are important in moderation, in balance, in the right ways, in the right places. And there are some places that it's not right to have those types of things. And increasingly, there are fewer and fewer and fewer places left that haven't been developed, bought up, sold off, whatever it might be. So, man, we just need to protect or care for and conserve those last few remaining places and resources we have. And speaking to kind of something you mentioned a little earlier, we talked a little bit about how this recent proposed reduction in these national monuments has gotten some people kind of using the same rhetoric that was used when we talked about the public land transfer, the proposed sale that Chavez had earlier in 2017, I guess, different things along those lines. Now, that kind of movement, the idea, or at least the public idea, people talking about it a lot, of trying to transfer or sell public lands, to your point, got such a severe blowback from the hunting and fishing community and others in the recreation community that I think that, from what I've seen and heard, that's kind of died down a little bit, just because they're kind of realizing how politically unpopular that is. But I think from what I'm gathering and seeing, it still seems like that is a push, but still maybe a long-term goal, but it's trying to be achieved by death by 1,000 cuts. It seems like now they're taking this tact to try to just slowly chip away at protection, slowly chip away at the resources available currently to agencies to manage these places, slowly chip away at things so that they can say, 5 years from now maybe, well, you guys aren't doing a good job of managing your national forest. You're not able to manage your BLM land. The states could do a better job. But of course, the reason being is that you slash our budgets by 85%. You took away our law enforcement, powers. You took all these different things. Am I right in this kind of analysis of what's happening?
Mark, what I love is that you're doing your research, and I think that you're spot on, and ever the student, right? And I think that's important for everybody that's listening to this, is that, don't believe the rhetoric, look at the facts, right? And I think you're exactly right, is that, I think that our community in particular, the sportsmen's community, has done an awesome job at pushing back. And so that has kind of gone to the back of the line, where, what part of the push to kind of sell/transfer these public lands has really ultimately been about extraction, and so now, as these protections are lifted, or as you say, budgets dwindle, some of the same things are being accomplished. And so I think it's, up to all of us to stay vigilant on that piece. And, I ultimately, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, and I think that, out of these times that sometimes you feel like there's a lot of pressure, some great things come from that. We've already talked about kind of, where the Antiquities Act came originally, and kind of this conservation ethic. That's because this country was in a rough spot. We're basically coming close to wiping a lot of wildlife, off the American landscape, and hunters, changed that. You look at the dirty 30s, when the lid was coming off the prairie, when we had the Dust Bowl, and that's when hunters stepped up, and we taxed ourselves through Pittman Robertson. We established a duck stamp, so that would go right back into habitat. There's organizations like Ducks Unlimited, the National Wildlife Federation formed then. You look at the 1960s, when actual rivers were on fire in this country, and that's where we got the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And so, as we see what's going on now, what I think is that I hope it does is that really ignites kind of this sportsman kind of conservation ethic that quite frankly maybe has been dormant for a little bit, and people become complacent a little bit. And so with these threats, I hope that more people step up to the plate, and that not only do we help stave off some of the things and the threats that are out there, but that that we unite and just make this country even better.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I've been spending a lot of time over the last year kind of studying the history of our public lands and the challenges we've faced. And to your point, there definitely is this back and forth that seems to happen every 10, 15 years, where we'll have a great success and then you have this blowback. So like you just said, like there's these issues that happen in the 30s and 40s. We all of a sudden establish some new protections. Hunters, fishermen, others step up. We have some great things like like you mentioned, Pittman and Robertson, etc.
Yep.
But then again, in the 50s and 60s, then you have a kind of a rise up of more industry, more extraction, a little bit of unfettered capitalism that kind of goes maybe a little bit too far. And then again, to your point, 60s and 70s, then there's the environmental kind of movement. And then it goes back the other way in the 80s with the Sagebrush Rebellion. And
right.
Again, it's this interesting yo-yo effect. So I hope you're right that we're now going to see, while there are threats, this is going to be an opportunity for all those that care about these places and these resources to again stand up and kind of slow things down a little bit. But could you elaborate a little bit on some of these different death by 1,000 cuts, things that are happening? You mentioned what's happening with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Bristol Bay. I think I would be interested in hearing about your thoughts on what's going on with the sage grouse conservation initiative that's being rolled back, the BLM management stuff being rolled back. I mean, there's going to be a lot of things like that all happening, and it's kind of fallen underneath the radar because there's so many things now. But before we have Land tackle that one, let's take a quick second to thank our partners at Whitetail Properties.
This week with Whitetail Properties, we are joined by Brandon Swartzlander, a land specialist out of Illinois. And Brandon is going to be telling us about the importance of getting the next generation involved with land management.
That's a great question. I think, me personally, I think getting kids involved early, and maybe not just kids, but anyone who hasn't experienced the outdoors or land. I mean, it's just such an awesome event. I honestly to God have to pinch myself sometimes because I get to do this for a living. But when I have girls and some of them hunt, some of them don't hunt, but just being out, we all shoot bows, and we all experience the outdoors. We shed hunt, we do all those things together. I just think that you can take away so much more by spending time with, whether it's your family or friends or whomever, in the woods or on a piece of land. It's so much better than having a phone stuck in your face or a laptop or whatever. I just think it gives us an opportunity to go back to what we were raised on, and I think maybe that's missing to some degree in society today. But I just think when you introduce things at an early age, I think I was probably 5 when I started in the outdoors with my dad, but it makes you want to be better, and it takes you away from things that can be a negative influence. I feel like it's such a positive thing for, especially with family. I mean, when you can do those things with your kids and your wife or whatever.
If you'd like to learn more and to see the properties that Brandon currently has listed for sale, visit whitetailproperties.com/Swartzlander. That's SWARTZLANDER.
And now back to my question for Land regarding other public land issues and concerns.
Yeah, I think sage grouse is what's going on with sage grouse is a perfect example. So step back, try to do it as high level as I can. I don't want to, if you want to ask more questions, please do. But sage grouse numbers are going down. Potential for them to be listed as endangered species is real. With that, if they were designated as an endangered species, that comes with all sorts of regulations and has huge implications for ranchers, has huge implications for oil and gas development. And so about a decade ago, people started working together, and it was oil and gas, ranchers, state agencies, federal agencies, hunter and angler kind of organizations, and some other kind of conservation organizations to try to how do we continue the traditions of ranching? How do we continue to develop oil and gas? And how do we protect this habitat? And so, through that, they came up with a conservation collaborative plan that really helped stave off the listing of that bird and was a path forward for everybody, which included, oil and gas development. And, I think that there's some folks that don't ever want to see any more oil and gas ever taken off of our public lands. And, I think they have a right to their opinion, but that's just not reality. So what this did is it really did a couple of things. It, made it so oil and gas will be done in kind of a phased kind of approach where instead of having a huge industrial complex like you're doing oil and gas development and then clean it up kind of as you go, and so the impacts on the resource are less. And then it really did a good job of staying out of like focal areas for sage-grouse habitat. And so, they do this thing called lekking in the spring where they get together and they do this little dance for the ladies, and that's kind of their breeding regimen. And any kind of disturbance around these areas really it makes them so they don't reproduce as well. And so those areas were left alone. They're called sage-grouse core areas. And so now this all happened, right? And I think collaboration, there's when you collaborate, you don't get everything that you want, and like that's just the nature of collaboration. And at the same time, I think that's the way America works, is that it's a compromise. And so it was a path forward that everybody could live with. And now, new administration, they're rolling back those conservation kind of collaborative plans. And what that does, I think it does a couple of things. I think it has the immediate impact to sage-grouse and the sage steppe ecosystem that they depend on, which also 340 other species depend on, like pronghorn antelope and mule deer in particular, but a host of songbirds and other species that I feel like are important to have on the landscape. So it has that initial impact there, but it's also this idea that you're not supporting this collaborative work that happened over a decade. And so collaboration is not easy. There's a lot of trust that is built there. And there's compromise, and those are tough decisions that are made, but they're made. And so, besides what this means to the habitat, like I think it really flies in the face of that kind of collaborative kind of effort. And that has implications, I think, outside of sage-grouse, has implications for other collaborative efforts that are going on all over this country. And to me, those are the two big hits. And, really, what the administration is talking about is rolling back these plans and then managing strictly for population size and not for habitat. And I think, population size is one indication on how things are doing. But, they've talked about raising pen sage-grouse, which has been tried with other grouse species that are very similar and has been highly ineffective. And then, what happens when you have a good population, let's say, of sage-grouse in Montana and Wyoming, and we decide that we're just going to sacrifice Idaho and Utah. So, to me, what's interesting is that the pushback has been pretty universal, both from Western governors, from the Republican Party and from the Democratic Party, and so, but they're not being listened to, and I think that's the troubling part about this piece. And so, as I think the real threat here is that, yes, you're going to have, like the oil and gas folks are going to have some initial years, as this is realized, where they get to maybe do things in a more kind of wide open arena. But what happens if this bird does get listed? That's again where they're going to have, then there'll be major regulations on what they can do, as well as the ranching community. And so that's the unfortunate side of this thing. And to me, it's just ignoring kind of what the people want, and listening to kind of one entity, and that really is the oil and gas entity. And that's not what that collaborative effort was about, and I don't think that's what America's about.
Yeah. Speaking of some of the issues with some extraction industry desires, I guess you had touched on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and I this past September got to go on a caribou hunt Not quite in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, just south of there a little ways. But me and Steve, Ranella and Yanni and that whole crew was up there and just had an unbelievable experience, and just getting a taste of that type of place, that kind of scale of a landscape, and seeing that wildlife, just the immensity of the amount of life there, in a seemingly untouched, still pristine place. It was unbelievable, and it is good to know that there are still places like that, and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is one such place that is so renowned. And I think it's one of those places that even if you never get to go there, just knowing that is still there, it's still available, that, at least for me, holds a lot of power, and value. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening there, why there's some potential new threats, and it's been an ongoing thing for decades, really, but why now, most recently, maybe there's some concern about the future of that area, too?
No, that's great. And by the way, super jealous that you got to go on that hunt.
It was great.
I had an opportunity to go on a hunt in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in August that one of our board members ended up going on. As well as, a film crew to go do a film up there. And it happened to be the same week as my wife's 40th birthday. And so I made the proper decision and stayed home. But I'm definitely jealous of that opportunity you had. I think I'd step back first is that part of when the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was designated, it was designated as a compromise to develop them on the North Slope. And so, oil and gas can be developed on the North Slope, and that's more appropriate there because it's a less sensitive kind of wildlife habitat, and landscape. And so there was this compromise made that, okay, we're going to the American people want oil and gas developed, and so let's do that on the North Slope. And they also want protections of, wildlife habitat, like these large landscapes that, as you described, we're not making any more of them, right? Like what we have now is what we have. And so that was that compromise, and it's really, it was not done without controversy, but it's so far it's carried forward, and it's, it's this amazing place. And so now, there's already kind of some testing that's been done on oil and gas potential, on the coastal kind of region of that refuge. That also happens to be where, the largest caribou herd up there, the porcupine herd, goes right through it. And so it's a very sensitive kind of area and those concerns. And so there's been some testing just to kind of, check on kind of the potential oil and gas deposits there. And then just recently, with the tax cuts that got passed, there was a provision in there and that basically is kind of starting the process for development up on the National Wildlife Refuge. So it's not realized yet, but it's definitely paving the way for it. And so it's one of these things, and I keep talking about compromise. And the reason I kind of keep bringing it up is because compromise has become this dirty word. It has become this dirty word, I think, out in Congress, out in Washington, D.C., but it's really kind of been, it's gone away from like the ethos, I think, of the American people. And so, you understand, everything's so black and white these days. And, you and I could go to the local tavern and try to figure out what kind of pitcher we're gonna buy, and if we're both black and white on that, like we don't drink the same beer, we don't really want to hang out. That's just not the way this world works. I don't think. I think people, they compromise all the time, whether that's with your home life and your significant other, or with your friends, or the way I think that Congress should work. And so this is a compromise that was put in place, and now the tides are turning the other way. And to me, it's again one of these special places that once you start to defile that, it's never, ever going to be the same. And while I didn't go on that trip this summer, it's a thing that I covet. And just seeing like the footage from that, and then, JR, our board member that went on that hunt, ended up harvesting a caribou, and, just to see the landscape that he was in and the reverence that he had coming back from that. It was a life kind of changing trip. And, maybe I'll never get to go up there, but man, it's going to be something that I dream about for the rest of my life. And just knowing that it's there, I think one gives me a little bit of solace that those kind of places are there, but it also gives something me to aspire to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's there's a lot more examples of these types of things happening right now. Like we kind of touched on a handful of them, but there's more. It's hard to keep track of everything, and sometimes it's hard to know what to do a little bit. And I think sometimes the disappointing thing, I think one of the disappointing things coming out of all this is that things like conservation and protecting wildlife habitat in these places, it's become very, very politicized, right? It's become a very partisan thing. And then unfortunately you get these dividing lines, drawn down the middle of groups of people, even though in many cases we believe and care about the same things. But when you draw this arbitrary line down the middle and say, well, if you are, if you're blue, you have to be on this side of the issue and that side of the line. And if you're red, you have to be on this side of the issue and that side of the line. And it makes things tough. And for example, think about this. I'm a huge, much to I know you won't like this, but I'm a huge Michigan State Spartan fan, right? So,
oh man,
I know you got those U of M roots, but I'm a huge Michigan State Spartan fan, and I'm part of that team. So when someone on the Spartans, when a player or someone makes a mistake or something, I tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. I will tend to say, no, that's fine. Or I tend to not want to talk badly about them. Or I tend not to want to say, no, you made a mistake. You got to do things differently, right? Because that's my team. I want to just, I kind of want to, you become almost an apologist. If your team does something that, even if you know it's wrong in the back of your mind, you want to kind of sweep it under the rug sometimes. And I worry sometimes that same kind of thing might be happening in the case of kind of what's happening with our public lands and wild places sometimes, because when you've got one team out there that's kind of cutting away at these places a lot, that's something that I think a lot of us can agree is not a good idea. But that team might be doing some other things that we do like a lot. So some folks might want to apologize for that or ignore that and just focus on the things that are, make them feel okay and comfortable with being on that team.
Right.
I think that's a danger, and I think that's a missed opportunity because lots of times that Michigan State Spartan that's making a mistake, he probably won't listen to the U of M fan, but they might listen to the Michigan State fan. The Michigan State fan has that disproportionate opportunity to make a change because you can say, hey, I'm on your team. I want to support you, but you're making some huge mistakes. Listen to your people. Start caring about these things. Now, this is a huge, analogy kind of about what's happening here with our public lands and some issues with some of these ideas coming from the Republican side of the political sphere that, I think there's a lot of folks in the hunting and fishing world that lean to the right side of right of center that have an opportunity to say, hey, folks, we voted for you, but this is not what we voted for, this specific type of thing. I mean, where do you stand on all that kind of stuff? I mean, how do we deal with this challenge? How do we make change when politics get all mixed in and messed up with it all?
I think that's a super awesome analogy, and I may steal it going forward. So if you ever hear me about it, at least I told you I was going to do it.
That's fine.
But that's okay. I guess I could ask permission, but I think it's an awesome analogy, and I think you're totally right. I think that this country is run by those who show up, and I think that when people I think hold people accountable. I think when they applaud folks for doing the right thing. I mean, there's a bunch of great stuff that's happening on Access right now that I think that is very important to applaud folks on from both sides of the aisle. I think that when there's things that are being done that kind of benefit of the doubt, or I'm on their team and I'm just going to kind of look the other way. That's where we enable that behavior, and I think that when you're on the team, like you said, I think sometimes you have more of an opportunity to influence. And so, I think again, going back to Congressman Chaffetz, back this last spring, that's a perfect example of, people from all walks of life, both sides of the aisle, both teams, pushing back and a politician listening, right? Like he pulled back his support of that bill within a week. And so I think it's vitally important for people to step up and raise kind of their opinions to folks when they disagree. And if you don't do that, then part of me is it's then you get what you get there. And to me, this country has always been run on those people that show up. And I think people's voices still do count, and I think that they're vitally important right now on an array of issues to really, talk about. And, I think there's the side of the aisle, that continually, and they're mostly on the coast. I think the Democrats in the center part of the country have gotten it, but there's still those that, that want heavy gun restrictions. That's not an issue that VHA really deals with. But, I think like Democrats can be pushing back to Democrats and pushing back on some of that stuff. I mean, I would say some of the same things about kind of some of the anti-hunting on that side. Restrictions, for mountain lion hunting in California is a good example. There's more Democrats that would step up and say that's not good for the resource and that's not good for, kind of carrying conservation forward. Maybe we wouldn't have gotten that ban there. And so I think that it's important for people to step up, and no matter what that issue is, and provide feedback, because ultimately that's what these, elected officials are elected for, is to represent the people. And if, you voice your opinion, that gives them more food for thought on how they will actually get things done. So, if I had any advice to people, is your voice does still count. At Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, we try to make that as easy as possible, provide you background, and then provide you email and phone numbers to utilize. And, just an example of that is on this, sage grouse kind of conservation plans, is that, they had a comment period that lasted, I think, through last Friday. And, we were making it easy for people to engage in that effort. And so whether that's us or with somebody else, I just encourage people to really do the research. I mean, you're very educated today and understand kind of the lay of the land, and that's because you've been taking the time to do it. And I think people need to do that, and they also need to engage.
All right, real quick before we move on, we're going to take our final break of the day for a word from our partners at Matthews Archery. And as we mentioned last week, Matthews recently launched their new Triax bow. So here with us today to talk a little bit more about that bow and the cross-centric cam system that is on that bow is Mark Hayes, a design engineer for Matthews Archery.
The cross-centric was born of a concentric cam, which was the no cam. So we'll start the story in 2015. We built the no cam HDR, which was the most tunable bow and the most accurate bow we've ever created. It was truly an experience to tune it. It could tune any arrow, whether it was spined correctly or not, or whether the user had a weird grip or not. It would just tune because of those concentric cams. Now, the one thing you could knock on a no cam was the speed. It did lack. Now, it wasn't slow by any means, but nowadays, how everyone's pushing the envelope on speed, it was not up to that bar. So in comes the Halon in 2016, the cross-centric cam. It allowed us to have that amazing tunability, incredible accuracy with the speed. The way we did that was the back side of the cam is actually concentric still. So at full draw...
And what does that mean? I'm sorry to interrupt, but what does concentric actually mean?
No problem. So the concentric means that the string track itself is a perfect circle with the center being the axle. And that means that your string will never change the distance from the axle. So you can imagine if you had two big cams on each side at full draw, they could be different distances from the axle if they were slightly out of tune. And that's going to throw a vertical knock travel into the path of the arrow. So with our burger buttons being the center in a concentric string track at full draw, no matter what, whether your timing's on or off slightly, you're always the same distance from the axle. Meaning it's going to be easy to tune and incredibly accurate.
If you'd like to learn more about the Matthews Triax or the cross-centric cam system, you can visit MatthewsInc.com. Yeah, and to your point about what BHA's got going on, really a lot of growth when it comes to those local chapters across the country now. We started a chapter in Michigan a couple of years ago that I'm on the board of directors for, and now I think Ohio and Texas and a lot of places. I know you guys originally had that stronghold in the West, and that's now grown across the country. So no matter where you're at, these are things that can apply to you and that I think should matter to Americans all across the the nation. And BHA is a great organization to help you and to help facilitate understanding these issues and taking action on them. So I would definitely encourage anyone listening. Again, I've talked about this a lot, but it's an organization worth taking a look at and getting involved with. Land, I want to real quick. I know you got to bounce here quickly, but just back to the issue we began with, the national monument thing. Just because I know this is one of those things that hunters and anglers are getting questions about, or they're hearing about, and they're just trying to wrap their head around it. Can you again just reiterate? We touched on this, but can you just reiterate like the bullet point 1, 2, 3 things that from a hunter and angler perspective we need to understand as far as what the recent announcements mean and what we as hunters and anglers might want to push for or advocate for in the coming weeks and months and years as this kind of becomes litigated and all those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is that access is being talked about a lot, and this was not a federal land grab. This was just increased protection, and so we could still hunt and fish all the monuments that were under review, after they were designated as national monuments, and that what this really is about is undoing protections. It's not about selling this land, and I think we've talked about that a few times, but I think it's important to reiterate because there's a lot of that rhetoric out there again that this is the president is stealing your land. Well, he's not stealing your land. He's just taking away protections. Ultimately, that would probably be bad for hunting and fishing. But we've got opportunities to still hunt and fish there now that these protections have been lifted. It's just like are we really going to want to go there if the habitat isn't there? And that has something to be determined. The lawsuits are going to happen. This will probably be decided by the Supreme Court. I'm confident, at least from the research that we've done, that this was an illegal activity and that these places will stay the same. But then you have, I think, really, legislative proposals that can change the law, which will ultimately decide on how these monuments are designated or potentially roll them back. I think as you look at national monuments, going forward, I would steer people again towards this report we did. It's called National Monuments: A Sportsman's Perspective. It really talks about the history of how national monuments came into play. It talks about, kind of some of the awesome places that you can hunt right now that are designated as national monuments. And it also talks about national monuments going forward and how we would like to see that happen. And I think the big pieces there is that hunters and anglers are involved, from the beginning in these designations, and so that their input is heard. I think that the state agencies maintains the management of those fish and wildlife resources that are there, and that the federal agencies that currently are engaged with those monuments, like the Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management, maintain that kind of level of management afterwards as well. So that's kind of like the simple and dirty. Stay tuned on that piece. I think we'll see what happens with the lawsuits, and then I think the more immediate threat probably is really with the legislative threats, and so just stay tuned on that front as well.
Yeah. Well, Land, I appreciate taking the time to walk us through all this. Lots of things happening these days when it comes to public lands, wildlife, and wildlife habitat, and I appreciate what you and your organization are doing to help keep hunters and anglers abreast of the issues, help us kind of make sense of it all, and then helping us, take action to protect these wild places and wild animals that we as sportsmen and women that we care so much about. So we appreciate that, Land, and I certainly will keep on doing my best to help the cause too.
Mark, appreciate your time today. Always enjoy getting on with you. Again, I think you've been doing your research, which I totally appreciate, and I think that through all these times with rhetoric, it's really important to kind of cut through that with information. And then I also say the last thing is a huge thank you. You guys are absolutely crushing it in Michigan. I think I saw something this week that you guys have increased membership, like 300% this last year. And that's just amazing to me. And that's because of the hard work that you guys are doing. And what I love about this organization is that it's real people doing real things. And, that's how this world works. And that's how it's going to be carried forward. So very much appreciate what you personally are doing in the chapter as well.
Well, there's lots to be done, and for a very, very important cause. So thank you, Land, and hopefully next time we can talk, it'll be about sharing or talking about some successes when it comes to some of these things, which I'm sure if we keep on working together, we can make happen.
Absolutely, man. Big high five across the phone.
And with that, we will wrap this episode up. If you'd like to learn more about this issue of national monuments from a hunter or angler perspective, I definitely would point you towards that document that Land mentioned, and you can find that on the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers website. That is backcountryhunters.org. The TRCP, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, has also been putting out some information on this issue. You can find info at trcp.org for that as well. Both of these organizations and many others are doing good work to help protect our public lands and waters and wildlife. So, as I've done many times before, I will just kind of urge you and encourage you to learn more about these things, to stay involved, to stand up for these places, for our wildlife, for our ability to hunt and fish. We need these places, we need these protections, we need public lands. So let's do that together. And finally, I guess I will just offer a few more simple things. Number one, if you've left a rating or review for the podcast, just want to give you a big thanks. There are, I think, over 1,200 5-star reviews now. That's incredible. We appreciate that. Also want to give a big thank you to our partners who help keep this podcast possible. So big thanks to Matthews Archery, Sitka Gear, Maven Optics, the Whitetail Institute of North America, Trophy Ridge, Yeti Coolers, and Huntera Maps. And of course, and maybe most importantly, we couldn't do any of this without you guys, the listeners. So thank you so much. I hope you're still hitting those tree stands, getting in the woods, enjoying some late season hunts. And if you are, I wish you luck. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.
I'm sure a lot of you guys remember the old ceremonial hunting tradition of eating the heart out of the first animal you kill. Meat from those organs are among the most nutrient-rich foods on the planet. You can get those same benefits your ancestors craved via convenient daily capsules from Heart and Soil. Find out more at heartandsoil.co. And remember, use code MeatEater for 10% off your purchase. You ever get that feeling the walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating you? You crave some wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe in a spot all your own. Well, head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, streams, you name it. Search by acreage. You can search by location. You can search by the kind of hunting and fishing you're dreaming of. Land.com. It is where the adventure begins.